There is UFOs. Fact, fiction or fantasy? Former foreign correspondent and international best-selling novelist Anthony Gray begins his personal investigation with Part 1, Sightings and Soundings.
Among the thousands of UFO sightings recorded worldwide in modern times, perhaps the most dramatic occurred in eastern England, at ground level in a forest at night.
We are getting an indication of a heat source. We're right at this position here, straight ahead. There it is again. There it is. I see it too. What is it? We don't know, sir. See if you can get the star scope on it. There's no doubt about it. There's some kind of strange flashing red light ahead. It's yellow. I saw a yellow tinge in it too. Weird. It's coming this way. It is definitely coming this way.
The voice of Colonel Charles Holt, recorded as he and his men caught sight of a UFO near their NATO airbase at Rendlesham Forest, Suffolk. Visiting the scene with an American guard who lived through it became, for me, the dramatic high point of this personal voyage of discovery, which has lasted several months. Trying to establish whether some UFOs might be alien spacecraft has in fact been my most difficult journalistic assignment ever. Evidence, mostly verbal, is everywhere, but outright proof still doesn't exist. 90% of all sightings usually have rational explanations, and no government admits that extraterrestrial beings are a reality. So whether there's life elsewhere in the universe remains one of the great unanswered questions of our time. But there are other complexities, even with a sighting like Rendlesham Forest. Jenny Randalls, author of some 30 UFO books and a top British investigator, is only too aware of them.
The incident at Rendlesham Forest in 1980 is clearly an extraordinary case, and I think one of the best attested UFO encounters in the history of the world. There is no doubt that something crashed down out of the sky, which was physically real because it left a gaping hole in the tops of the pine trees and indentations in the ground. It left radiation levels several times greater than anything that was sprinkled over Britain in the wake of the Chernobyl nuclear reactor accident. So yes, there clearly was a physically real object there. It also turned up on radar, and it was witnessed at close quarters by trained military personnel, one of whom got close enough to try to touch it. Now, the problems come when you try to interpret what that something was, because just because something turns up on radar, just because it leaves a hole in the tops of pine trees and scatters radiation over a forest and is seen by witnesses as some strange glowing object, doesn't prove that that something was an extraterrestrial visitor.
My own curiosity about this whole subject had been triggered by a close encounter with a mundane UFO book 4 years ago. From there, I trod onward slowly, keeping an ever-open mind. And when I began this investigation, it seemed sensible first to take a sounding from someone who spends his entire working life in the sky, but who's also very down-to-earth, like airline pilot Captain Graham Shepherd.
I was flying from Scotland to Heathrow. It was a bright sunny day, and we were alerted by Preston radar, and he advised us that we had opposite direction traffic, fast moving, in the airway, and it was unknown. And we looked out, and into view almost immediately came this disc-shaped craft, slightly raised centre, and it was shining in the sunlight, and I had excellent depth reference on it because below us were fair weather cumulus clouds. Now, having come so close to us, it would have been trailing a shock wave which we would have felt, but there was no shock wave, and on top of that, when we landed, we didn't report it as an air miss. Now, if it had been an aeroplane, we would have reported it because it was far too close to us. And I've talked to a large number of pilots, some of whom have had very interesting experiences, and in no way will they ever go public. They will not talk about it in public, and they certainly wouldn't commit anything to writing. And it's an unhappy climate, actually, which has persisted since the 50s, and it was initiated by the American military, imposing fines and jail sentences on pilots, where pilots were discouraged, really, on the basis of fear of ridicule and possibility of losing their jobs.
So yet more complexities are added, further blurring the search for evidence. Pilots seem to me one of the most reliable sources on UFO sightings, but before setting out on journeys that took me to France, Germany, and to New York in the worst blizzard in its history, I investigated those scientific schools of thought which maintain that UFOs may not be all they seem, whoever claims to see them. Prominent in this field is Susan Blackmore, a senior lecturer in psychology at the West of England University.
Airline pilots are very interesting because on the whole they have a much better knowledge of objects in the sky than ordinary people. They are much less likely to be tricked, as it were, by things like reflections in glass and so on, which trick many people. However, they have the same kind of minds that we all have, a visual system that will take, a flickering shadow and turn it into a solid object.
What are the actual mechanics in the mind which cause this false idea?
Well, the most important fact is to understand the way memory works. Memory is not like a tape recorder that stores all the information and then you play it back. The brain is constantly changing and is sort of updated, if you like, all the time by everything that happens. Now, when we try to imagine something, we've got to think to ourselves, well, is that just something I fantasized, or was that really a memory? Now, what happens when you tell stories about your own past, and you keep on telling the story, is that story becomes so fixed in your own mind that it comes to seem to you as vivid and real as any actual memory.
It makes it sound that it's rather difficult sometimes for people to trust their perceptions. Is that a sort of standard psychologist view?
Oh, absolutely. All our perceptions are, if you like, constructions of the mind. We take in all the information through our ears and eyes and so on, and we make the best guess we can about what is actually out there. Almost all UFOs are created by the mind, not by objects out in space. But there remains a little chink in that, a little possibility in my mind that there may be things visiting us. But most UFOs turn out to be either the moon or Venus or other common objects in the sky. And also we underestimate the powers of our own mind to transform things and to make us see what we expect to see rather than what's actually there.
I have been accused of various things. I've been accused by scientists of hallucinating. I've been accused by somebody else of not being sufficiently trained in meteorology to know what I'm talking about. I've also been accused by an astronomer of misperception. The denial is extreme in some cases, and I found that people really don't want to hear in detail what I have to say. I think this is such an important subject. It is potentially one of the most important changes that the human species will have to confront, because it is our future in a way. If somebody else has done this, then inevitably one day we shall do it as well.
Captain Graham Shepherd defending his point of view. Yet, is it also possible that UFO sightings can be explained by changes in the Earth's magnetic field, or the global electromagnetic pollution of our time? Science writer and lecturer Albert Budden elaborates this hypothesis.
I do think there are physical UFOs that can be photographed and seen from different locations and witnessed by different people, but I don't think they're nuts and bolts flying saucers that fly about in the atmosphere. I think they are basically a natural phenomenon called Earth lights, which are balls of electromagnetic energy that come out of the ground at fault lines, and these light phenomena can have physical effects on the environment. They can burn witnesses, they appear on radar screens, they can be photographed. There's a whole range of electromagnetic light phenomena in the atmosphere that are the real UFOs.
So are you saying that even when somebody seems to see a craft which seems to be metallic and which seems to be very solid in form, that is just light, just energy?
Well, I think if you look at these reports, you find that 95% of them, even quite promising ones of what appears to be watertight cases of craft and lights and ladders and windows, turn out to be misidentifications of mundane objects in unusual conditions. Kites, birds, balloons, planes, stars, meteors. There's a very high percentage, and the UFO phenomenon is basically a mixture of different things.
And do you think at the base of it there are no extraterrestrial craft coming from outside this planet?
I think that's a fantasy. But and all of the hundreds of landings and contacts that's supposed to have been, we haven't got as much as an alien paperclip.
Albert Budden, Because most governments remain silent and mainstream science generally ignores untestable phenomena, many self-styled UFO investigators have appeared all over the world. They meet frequently, and I went to 3 such conferences in a few weeks. At the 4th UFO World Congress in Dusseldorf, Professor John Mack, a psychiatrist of the Harvard Medical School and a Pulitzer Prize winner, was the main speaker. He's written a best-selling book about claimed alien abductions, and I'll be investigating that area in the next program. But at Dusseldorf, Professor Mack introduced a filmed report by a young schoolgirl in Zimbabwe, which held his audience spellbound.
Now what happened was this. On September 16, 1994, after 2 days in which a very bright, unidentified flying object was tracked on radar across the country of Zimbabwe, an extraordinary event occurred on that Friday morning at about 10:15 at the Ariel School. The children were at break. The 11 and 12-year-olds had the responsibility of supervising the 9 and 10-year-olds. The teachers and their headmaster were all in a staff meeting, and none of them observed what happened.
I saw little objects hovering. It was quite big, actually, and then there was little ones all around it. And it looked as if they were changing spaceships.
Changing spaceships? And what does that mean? Who was changing?
The people inside the spaceships.
Yes.
Were running in different directions.
But the running you saw was inside the ship itself?
No, they were outside.
Oh, you saw them outside?
Yes.
How many of the, what do you call these beings? What do you call them?
Well, everybody calls them aliens.
Do you want to call them aliens?
I would have just called them strange beings.
So how many of these strange beings did you see?
I saw one main one, and other people said they saw other ones, but I saw one, and it had big eyes. That's all I saw about it, big eyes.
Where did you see
a black body?
The black body. How far away would you guess you were from this strange being?
About 3 to 4 meters.
3 to 4 meters, so you were really close. And what was this strange being doing? Was he moving around, running around, or was he standing looking at you?
No, he was standing staring at me. He was quite scary.
What was scary about him?
His big eyes, I think. His eyes looked at me as if, I want to...
I want you.
Yeah, I want you to come with me. I want you to come.
Did you go with him, do you think?
No, only my eyes went with him.
Your eyes went with him?
And my feeling.
And your feeling went with him. So was there a part of you that wanted to go with him?
Yeah.
That felt like drawn to go with him?
Yeah.
Okay, so can you see what that felt like?
Again, a little scary and a little excited.
Yeah.
And a little I shouldn't go.
That little girl's report from Southern Africa was a highlight of the Congress. But there was no shortage of reports from other continents. And a Brazilian science teacher, A.J. Gebert, who's the president of the Brazilian Center for UFO Research, claims that the skies over Latin America in particular are aswarm with activity.
Well, in Brazil and in other countries of South America, we have detected almost every sort of UFO sightings, landings, contacts, and abductions in special areas of Brazil and in Argentina and in Puerto Rico and in Chile and Peru and Colombia. We're talking about people who live and work in farms. We talk about people who have gone to big cities once or twice in their lifetime. They don't have bookshops, they don't have magazines that they can read, they don't have access to television, you know. Most people don't even know that the UFO exists. They don't know that they are supposed to tell it to anyone. And if they know that they are supposed to tell, they don't know to whom they are supposed to tell. I'm someone who has feet on the ground. I have never seen a UFO in these 20 years I've been investigating. I don't even dream about UFO, never. Never. But I gotta tell you, I gotta know everything about these guys. Do they have religions? What do they know about God? What was Jesus Christ? Do they love? Do they make sex? Do they have BBC in their planet? Whatever. We gotta know that. You know, I can't sleep when I start thinking about that, you know? And maybe they have solutions or answers to most of our questions.
I found participants in the UFO conferences, and indeed all investigators of this subject, to be generally sincere, rational people. Among them was Larry Warren, who had been an anti-terrorist guard at the twin air bases of RAF Bentwaters Woodbridge in December 1980. He was in nearby Rendlesham Forest with his deputy base commander, Colonel Holt, whose strained voice we heard at the start of this program. I went back to Suffolk with Larry to relive the most traumatic night of his life.
Okay, this is it. Over this little rise, I saw a glow of light. And I could hear a lot of radio transmissions. I could see people moving on the hill. Colonel Holt and his people. Out that way is a second farmer's field. This would be his second. He was about 1.25 miles over that way now, having other objects sighted. And this is a spot sitting right on this side with my boss, was an airman who had obviously seen something so disturbing that he was sitting like this with his hands around his head. And he was sitting here crying. And my boss was trying to calm him down. We went past that. And I knew we weren't fighting a fire or having a training exercise. There was something wrong. Right here in front of me was a circular mist. It was greenish-orange, but translucent at times. You could see the ground through it. I stood here, and I was looking at this in shock, basically. What the hell is this? What are we seeing? As I stood out here, my movement was half speed. I had a Timex watch, much like this, but silver, and I went to look at it for some reason, and movement was very slow. The sky was different and wrong. Movement was slow, and perceptions were altered. Where everything changed is that from that distant stand of trees, straight out, was a red light. And this red light started probably where you can see the clouds now, at that height, and it made a straight line toward us. The light exploded. The short light or whatever was so bright that I suffered flash burns to the retinas of my eyes. Other personnel did too. In that instant, we had a solid, structured craft of undetermined origin. Very large, probably 30 feet at its base. It had three sharp appendages, mother of pearl, rainbow effect on it. If you looked dead at it, it would distort. You had to see it with your peripheral vision to get the full impact. And it's that right here. I mean, we're right where this thing is. And it seems so comical now to look back like it's some, the stories and some movies, but it isn't.
At that point, Larry had been one of about 80 American troops surrounding the glowing object. Military photographers and cameramen were recording the scene. As he shared memories of this climactic moment with me, Larry's face showed new signs of tension.
We were very close to the object. Our shadows seemed to be cast onto it, and yet we had no lighting equipment to do such things. It was impossible in hindsight. There were three type of living beings of some sort, and they weren't your traditional thing that's in pop culture now with the gray skin and all. This is almost translucent things, but there was a face, and there was big eyes it had, and you could see a sense of clothing, but then again, was it not? I don't know. But there were three individual things above the ground in this light. I saw the center one adjust its head at one point, so I knew these were I assumed they were living things, not projections, not tricks of any kind. Because our commander is a very tall guy, and this thing almost seemed to adjust its head to look at his face. And that was all film. Every bit of it was. So I wish I had known everything I'd end up going through. I would have grabbed some of the footage and run home that night. But yeah, I wish I had.
Larry Warren is now co-authoring a book about his experience and how it's affected his life. because he passionately wants the world to know what happened to him and others involved. Larry's view that the events at Rendlesham have been deliberately covered up by the American and British government is more dispassionately confirmed by Jenny Randalls.
There are certain things we can say with assurance about the Rendlesham Forest case. For example, we can say that an event happened. We can say that the British and American government have lied to the public about it, because clearly they knew more about it than they've ever let on. They clearly know that an event of great magnitude occurred, which bamboozled senior military personnel who are trained to deal with situations like this and were thrown totally out of their depth by it. Now, they would not have a clue when that experience first happened, whether they were dealing with alien visitors, some kind of strange natural energy, a terrorist attack or whatever. Clearly, as a consequence of that, they had to take the cautious approach and investigate the matter most thoroughly, and mountains of paperwork must have been produced as a result of that. Yet, officially, according to both the British and American governments, there was no investigation at all. There are no records anywhere appertaining to this case, and basically nobody took it seriously at all. If that were true, I'd actually be more worried about the defence of this country than if they actually investigated it and decided that the public didn't have a right to know whatever it was that they had discovered.
On checking, I recalled that December 1980 was one of the danger points of the Cold War. Soviet troops had massed on the Polish border because the trade union movement's solidarity was threatening communist rule. The United States and NATO had just warned Moscow not to invade, and the air bases were on alert in Suffolk. Other witnesses saw UFOs directing beams onto the nuclear weapons bunkers. So, outlandish though the question seemed, I asked the best-selling British UFO author Timothy Good whether he thought the nuclear weapons could have been interfered with.
It is quite possible. This is not unprecedented. There have been many cases worldwide where UFOs, and these are officially documented cases, so I'm not talking out of the top of my head. People study my books. They can see these reports by various intelligence agencies and security police and so forth. There have been cases in Canada, in the States, in Russia, many other countries where UFOs have hovered over nuclear weapon missile delivery systems and have paralyzed those rockets or the weapon systems.
Of this incident in Rendlesham Forest in 1980, the Ministry of Defence in Britain said, I believe there was no threat to national security.
Precisely. That's what Lord Hill Norton has said on numerous occasions. A former Chief of Defence Staff and Chairman of the NATO Military Committee, he's convinced that it was a threat to our national security, and a very serious one.
Something landed at Rendlesham. There's no question about that. Either the Deputy Commander of the U.S. Air Force Base, Colonel Hall, and his merry men were hallucinating, in which case that must be of defense interest to Her Majesty's government, because it was a nuclear-capable Air Force base. Or, if they were not hallucinating but telling the truth, then, without any doubt, something happened which was of keen defense interest, and it is absurd of Ministry of Defense spokesman to say otherwise.
After hearing those views from Admiral Lord Hill Norton, who was Chief of the Defence Staff from 1971 to 1973, I asked the Ministry of Defence in London if it still believed there had been no threat to national security at Rendlesham Forest. An official spokesman told me, "We have no evidence of a threat to our security from outer space." Investigators have obtained hundreds of documents about UFOs in America and Britain under the US Freedom of Information Act. But while confirming many sightings, they don't provide all the answers. Dr. Rowney Kilder, a former Chief Medical Officer of Health for Lapland, is now an international UFO researcher, and she claims to have knowledge of other secret documents not yet released.
One of them, interestingly, is the NATO report of 1961 to 1964. It was so secret that at times only 15 copies were made for the whole world. And it was made because NATO mistook the 50 UFOs flying in formation from east to west, from Russia over Europe, and we almost started a Third World War. In that NATO report, it states the reasons why people are not allowed to get the information. Number one is theology. All the dogma of world religions will collapse. Number two, human ego will collapse. We think we're the greatest in the universe. We are like Stone Age people in technology, in morals, in ethics, in comparison to other cosmic civilizations. Number 3 was our economy. We pay for gas, oil, and electricity. They use free energy from the air, zero-point energy, so to say. So that is a great economical question. And number 4 was the laws of physics. The speed of light for them is peanuts, and therefore our university teachings have to be changed.
But we can depend that you have seen this report yourself?
I have not seen the report, but I have heard of it, and I know the person who has seen it. He is an American military who was working at that time in the 60s in SHAPE headquarters, and he mentioned that he has gotten permission from the highest possible level to give out this information.
So are you saying that NATO is slipping this information out to ufologists gradually?
Yes. In my mind, this is exactly what is the case.
Former nuclear physicist Stanton Friedman, who has been investigating the subject professionally for almost 37 years, supports Dr. Kilder's views about the significance of the cover-up, but doesn't believe it's starting to crumble yet.
The subject of flying saucers represents a kind of cosmic Watergate, meaning that some few people within the governments of the United States, Britain, Canada, and undoubtedly many other countries, have known since July 1947, when 2 crashed saucers and several alien bodies were recovered in Roswell, New Mexico, that indeed some UFOs are alien spacecraft. What do I think the government knows? I think it certainly knows that we've learned a lot technologically, that aliens are coming here, that they're abducting people, that they are monitoring, if you will, our military installations. None of the arguments by a very small group of very noisy negativists, as I call them, stand up under careful scrutiny. Your arguments sound great until you look at the evidence and then they collapse. We're dealing with the biggest story of the millennium. Visits to planet Earth by alien spacecraft, successful cover-up of the best data, obviously the bodies and the wreckage, for 48 years.
What do you think is behind the biggest story of the millennium? Where is it going to lead, do you think?
Well, I think the cards are in the hands of the aliens, if you will. Obviously, they're not here to land in Trafalgar Square or to get on television programs or even BBC radio programs. They're here for their purposes. So we probably don't have much control over what happens, except whether or not the governments of the country or countries of the world are forced to put some of the data out on the table. And it's clear from the documents we do have that agencies such as the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, have been withholding just loads of UFO data. So the question then becomes, will the government finally come clean? That'll only happen, I think, if the media would make the same effort blowing the lid off the cosmic Watergate as the Washington Post did off the political Watergate. It takes work. It takes effort. Anybody who says there isn't a cover-up hasn't done his homework.
Momentous claims from Stanton Friedman, and it's perhaps the enormity of such issues that cause the vast majority of journalists to sit uneasily on the fence over the whole subject of UFOs, or to report it tongue-in-cheek to protect themselves from public ridicule. Yet between 5 and 10% of all UFO sightings remain persistently unexplained, and there's no shortage of informed people who believe that alien spacecraft are neither fantasy nor fiction, but a fact. Among the most emphatic is Admiral Lord Hill Norton.
What I would say is that there is now overwhelming evidence that there are physical objects flying about in our atmosphere which are not made in this world. It behoves governments to find out what they are and come clean about how to deal with whoever is directing them.
Sightings and Soundings, Part 1 of the series UFOs, Fact, Fiction or Fantasy. It was written and presented by Anthony Gray and produced by Angela Hind. The series is a Lathon Limited production for the BBC World Service.
BBC World Service on 648 kHz media
program in the series UFOs, Fact, Fiction or Fantasy. Former foreign correspondent and international best-selling novelist Anthony Gray continues his personal investigation with Part 2, The Abduction Phenomenon.
People in many countries around the world claim that they're being abducted into UFOs and subjected to frightening medical experiments. At first hearing, such reports sound like pure fantasy. But I've listened to sane, sincere people who are quite convinced it has happened to them.
I was out walking with my two children, and as we were walking back, my daughter said, "Mum, the moon's coming towards us." And this oval object was just hurtling through the sky. This thing then dropped vertically into a field, and it just hovered roughly 2 foot off the ground, and we just stood there transfixed. We couldn't do a thing.
And I remember being outside my window in midair, bathed in a bluish-white light, very bright light. And I remember looking up and seeing the underside of this, and I knew that was a craft. It opened like a clam, and inside there were different color lights, which really frightened me, because I was going towards it.
I remember me being in this big, round, massive big room, and it was that bright. Everything was sort of really white, and you saw these small beams putting me on this sort of table.
Richard showed me strange things which I did not understand. Even now, I don't understand what I saw. And I was in horrible pain. It just was crazy.
You may find listening to these stories of claimed abductions disturbing. I certainly did, even while keeping a rigorously open mind about whether they could be true or not. The so-called aliens that these people describe are mainly small, grey, black-eyed creatures with domed heads, and reports of them first appeared in America in the early 1960s. Since then, claims have gradually multiplied worldwide, and 2 investigators have won prominence through books published internationally. One is successful New York artist Bud Hopkins, author of Missing Time and Intruders. The other is David M. Jacobs, a history professor who wrote Secret Life. I flew to the United States and talked to David Jacobs in his snowbound Victorian villa outside Philadelphia, among heaps of new unopened letters from claimed abductees. I met Bud Hopkins and, as you'll hear, his 2 lively cats in his Manhattan studio loft. There he has conducted many sessions of memory-jogging hypnosis with abduction claimants who often suffer partial or total amnesia about the time of their experiences. Between them, Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs gave me a composite picture of this phenomenon, and Bud began by explaining what most people report to him.
They're taken up into the craft, floated up, usually up a beam of light. We don't know how any of that operates. They are then led into a room where there is a table, very little other furniture, and somehow they are undressed, put on the table, and then a physical examination takes place. People describe the attention to the joints, to the genitals, the lower abdomen, to the head, etc. The person will describe early on what seem to be sample-taking processes where little scoop devices are used to remove a layer of cells. We assume for some sort of analysis. We have no idea why. And one of the things that happens eventually is that sperm and ova samples are taken.
The person who is abducted wants to run, they want to resist, they want to not be there. They can't. They are powerless in all senses of the word. There are some people who will resist on all occasions. People will simply drop to the floor and force these beings to carry them. People resist in all sorts of different ways. I've had people reach up and grab an alien by the neck. We've had people who have spit in the face of them when they feel that they have some control over their neck and mouth. We see a kind of program here that lasts 24 hours a day in, day out, month after month, year after year, decade after decade. In other words, the amount of energy placed in this program, from what we can tell, is quite extraordinary.
Abductions can take place under almost any circumstance one wants to mention. I've had people who were abducted from a party. A woman was sitting on the couch, and she suddenly realized she was moving, floating off the couch with her legs folded under her. People can be taken from their bedroom at night when they're asleep, very commonly. People can be taken from an automobile. I've had cases where a car which contains 6 people is stopped. 3 people are taken, the other 3 are left in the car in a switched off state of suspended animation. It can be literally almost any circumstance, day or night.
A lot of what you're doing depends on your hypnotic regression of the people that come to you. You're an artist, and people say, well, how does he know how to hypnotize? How did that come about? How did you learn to do that?
I spent 7 years bringing people, abductees, to other therapists, psychiatrists, psychologists, people doing hypnosis. And I sat in as an apprentice.
Isn't there a danger that perhaps they remember things that you want them to remember, or encourage them subconsciously even to remember?
One of the things I do is I tape record every single session I ever do, and I put the transcripts in my books. Somebody can read them. The generic argument is, he must be leading it. And then you say, okay, let's find examples. And there's stunning silence.
So what do they do? What is this table about?
I don't know how I got up on that table, but I'm sitting on that table. And I can move. I can move now. Someone, one of them, coming over to me with this thing that looks like a pick, a dental pick. Oh, I'm going to put that in my mouth.
Well, he's not going to put it. Maybe we don't know whether he's going to put it, but we don't know. But we know you're okay the next day. Always remember, you're okay the next day.
We have to remember that many, many people remember a great deal when they come to me. I've worked with a number of people who remember everything from start to finish without hypnosis. I have to look into each case that comes along to find out what happened. I have 3 options. I can believe that the person is a liar, making up a case. I can believe that that the person really believed it happened, but it didn't. There's some kind of glitch, or they were impressionable, or they saw a television program, whatever. Or that it did happen and they're telling the truth. The skeptics have it very easy. They don't believe that the third is even a possibility. I have to deal with 3 possibilities. I have a larger job of investigation.
Remembered under hypnosis or not, much of that sounds like the stuff of nightmares. Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs each say they know of thousands of such cases, and David Jacobs, after some 15 years of research, believes there's a single purpose behind it all.
Every once in a while, a woman will say that the procedure that is being conducted upon them is not an egg-taking procedure, that they feel that something is being inserted in them as opposed to taken out. At which point the beings will say to the woman something to the point of, now you are pregnant. The woman will come back from the abduction event, forget what happened, and the next day begin to feel pregnant. Now, she knows this can't be possible. She's had no sexual relations with anybody for a long time, let's just say. Or, it's just impossible. It can't be done. But yet, the feelings of pregnancy will persist. She might go to her gynecologist, have a blood test, and it shows positive. And she is indeed pregnant. But it's so bizarre that she keeps thinking this, even though the signs are there, it doesn't make any sense. Between 1 and 11 weeks after the initial event, she will have another abduction. And this time, she will say something is being taken out. And they will take out a little fetus and sometimes show her so she can see what they have done. And then the next day, she suddenly feels that she's not pregnant. Her period returns, everything is normal, and she thinks it was just a bizarre and strange false alarm. Having said that, from time to time, women will be taken into nurseries where they will see many, many babies laying in special sort of containers. And one of the beings will indicate to them that one of the babies, or 2 or 3 of the babies, are theirs. And we think that this is the focus of the abduction phenomenon, the production of these offspring, these babies.
These things are going to sound absolutely outlandish to people hearing these things for the first time. How certain can you be of what you're saying?
Well, of course, these stories are outlandish to everyone, and they certainly were outlandish to abduction researchers when we first began to look at these. The first thing that an abduction researcher does is try to figure out what could account for this that is not related to aliens or abductions. And the problem is they all say the same thing. This is important to remember. Whether they are extremely educated and articulate, whether they're extremely uneducated and inarticulate, it does not matter. When I first encountered this phenomenon, and I first began to do hypnotic regressions, And I worked with my first people, and it began to dawn on me that, in fact, this was something that might indeed be actually happening. I walked around for 6 months saying, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, every single day.
That sense of distress felt by David Jacobs, who is a genial family man as well as a meticulous academic historian, is often shared by Bud Hopkins, who has himself spent nearly 20 years investigating the subject.
It's a phenomenon that shreds the fabric of your belief system, whatever it is, because every single thing is, in a certain sense, taken away. One can be passed through a solid wall and taken. Well, that's impossible. How can that happen? It does happen. One can be somehow made to not be seen. People can be lifted up beams of light. People are missing. People are returned after these experiences with physical marks on them. One of the more amusing details, if there's anything amusing connected with this, is that we have numbers of cases where several people are taken at once, and when they return to their bed, say, if this is a nighttime experience, they're returned with the wrong clothes on. One woman, for instance, went to bed wearing her new white nightgown, and she woke up wearing a green man's T-shirt.
What are you saying? These are from other abductees?
Yes, from other abductees. Clothes are mixed up in the craft. Now, how I'm trying to characterize this is you have this totally paranormal craziness of people floating through closed surfaces, going up beams of light, and yet you have this total nuts and bolts physicality to these experiences.
When you come to this whole subject, whether you're a journalist or somebody listening to this program, you really want evidence of some kind, and there is so little evidence. You have to depend largely on word of mouth. Are there any incidents you can cite of physical evidence for the abduction experience?
Well, my basic idea about physical evidence is that we have every single solitary kind of physical evidence one could possibly want, except an object that all of science would agree could not have originated on Earth. That's the only kind we don't have. Have we recovered implants in people's bodies that are extremely unusual? Can't prove that it came from outer space, but they shouldn't have been where they were. Yes, we have. This is this X-ray. See this thing?
Yeah.
It's a straight line with a curlicue on the top and on the bottom.
It looks like it's a sort of cylindrical wire. And what do you imagine these implants are?
Now, there are three theories that are common. A monitoring device, a locator device, and a way of inputting information or controlling the person. We wish, of course, that we had photographs of abductions taking place. I don't know that we do have many photographs of murders being committed. I don't like this phenomenon. I don't like this, the entire business. There's nothing about it that makes me feel hopeful, happy, optimistic. It's quite disturbing.
The opinions and conclusions of Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs are disputed in other academic fields. Clearly, the experiences of most people who feel they've been abducted are real to them. But some neuroscientists, notably Michael Persinger of the Laurentian University in Ontario, Canada, believe that such experiences could be generated by mechanisms in our own minds. Susan Blackmore, a senior lecturer in psychology at the University of the West of England, explains how this might come about.
I think there are two main mechanisms involved in producing abduction experiences. One is sleep paralysis. Now, this is a very, very common experience, very little researched and very little understood. We know that when people are asleep and dreaming, their whole body is paralyzed. All the muscles are so relaxed they can't move. This has to be so, otherwise you would act out your dreams. Now, sometimes the mechanism goes wrong and you wake up while still paralyzed, or the paralysis comes on before you fall asleep. Then you are in what is called sleep paralysis. You are awake, alert, you feel yourself and alive, but you can't move. It's terrifying. And I think that many modern UFO abduction stories are like that. But I think sleep paralysis is only one of the mechanisms. The other main one is activation of the temporal lobes. Now, the temporal lobes of the brain are on either side, just above the ears. Although we don't understand all the many things they do, we do know that they are involved in all kinds of fantasy and very closely related to the parts of the brain dealing with emotion, and they're critical in memory. And also that if you stimulate the temporal lobes, you get sensations of floating and flying, and deja vu, that sense of I've been here before, and mystical sense, a feeling of profoundness, and so on.
You yourself subjected yourself to an experiment by, I think, Michael Persinger with the temporal lobes. How did you feel during that?
Oh, that was one of the most extraordinary experiences of my life. I'm really not exaggerating. What happened in this experiment is that he put a special helmet on my head which would deliver a rapidly fluctuating magnetic field across the temporal lobes and stimulate them into kind of simulated unstable activity. And what happened was several really bizarre, absolutely discrete experiences. For example, suddenly it felt as though hands had gripped my shoulders and were pulling me upright into a sort of sitting up position. If I hadn't known there was a helmet doing it, I would have been sure that somebody grabbed me from behind. And another time, a little bit later, I suddenly felt very angry for no reason at all. Then I felt as though one of my legs was being pulled and stretched and pulled as though almost went up the wall. And that reminded me of one abductee who told me that he was pulled legs first up a wall by aliens. That experience brought a whole lot of things together. I really felt after that, yes, I can understand how if something like this happened to you for perfectly normal reasons in a perfectly normal brain, that the natural thing to do would be to think that you've been abducted and someone offered to hypnotize you and take you back to your true memory and so on. You would want to go along with it, and I can see how you could very, very easily build up on that basis the idea that you were abducted and be completely convinced, as most of the abductees that I've met appear to be.
The views of Susan Blackmore. But are such views widely held? International gatherings of scientists have been convened to discuss the abduction phenomenon, and British UFO researcher Jenny Randles has participated. Has she found any abduction consensus developing?
I went to the MIT symposium, that's the symposium at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, a very major event, and it involved leading researchers from all over the world coming together to pool their research for 6 days on what we understand about the abduction phenomenon. And one of the tasks that I performed for that was a complete survey of all the known abduction cases in Britain up until that point in time, of which there were about 60. The consensus is largely one of confusion. I mean, I know I've worked with a number of clinical psychologists and psychiatrists and sociologists who've had no prior knowledge of what the UFO or abduction phenomenon is all about. And when they've dealt with 2 or 3 witnesses and they've realized that this is not a simple, easy phenomenon that they can explain away as a delusion, or often as something called fantasy-prone personality hypothesis. In other words, that there are certain groups of people who have such a vivid fantasy life that they struggle to tell the difference between fantasy and reality. But as soon as they tackle the evidence, they realize that that explanation doesn't work. And they're left then struggling with a way to find an answer, because it's something that they hadn't realized, that the actual evidence is stronger than they thought it would be, and that there is no obvious psychological explanation for what is happening. So the problem is, you see, you're left with this who do you believe situation. When you're researching a subject, you can't afford to believe anybody within these cases. We have a lot of well-attested evidence in terms of verbal testimony, but we have virtually nothing in terms of hard, solid evidence to prove any theory is true above any other.
Theorizing by scientists is fine, but one of the reasons I travelled to New York was to try to talk to Linda Cortile, an attractive Italian-American woman who lives in sight of Brooklyn Bridge in Lower Manhattan. It's claimed that she was seen by 20 or more witnesses whilst being floated up the outside of her apartment block in a blue shaft of light, escorted by 3 aliens. A glowing craft was said to be hovering overhead. Linda is the central figure of the Brooklyn Bridge abduction, the most famous case of its kind. And like most self-styled abductees, she has usually shunned publicity. But when we met, she told me what she remembered of that night.
I was frightened. And I wasn't just fearful of what was happening to me. I was afraid I was going to fall and splatter all over the pavement down below. I couldn't understand how I was standing out there. I thought maybe I was standing on something that was hard, a hard surface or something. But I felt a lot of pressure in my chest, which made it difficult for me to breathe. But I felt pressure in my tear ducts, and I wondered where the tears went. Because if they did come out, I didn't feel them. So it was very frightening. And then I didn't remember much after that, except being inside the craft and sitting on a table and having someone scrape my arms. I don't know if they were using tools or they sit, but they were pounding on my back, and what I remember is the impression that I had. I thought that maybe they were counting my vertebrae. And then after that, I just dropped back into my bed.
Eerie though Linda Cortille's story is, it's not an isolated case. Similar stories are being reported from China, Japan, the Philippines, Australia, South America, Europe, and Africa. At the 4th World UFO Congress in Dusseldorf, I heard an interview with a middle-aged African. In parts of that continent, aliens are known as Madinda, and he claimed that while on an alien examination table, a naked female being clambered onto him.
She felt utterly unnatural. She felt like a dead body. You know, when you make love to a real woman, you feel the beat of her veins and arteries. You feel the warmth of her. You feel the heat and the smell. But this creature had none of those things.
What was the feeling when she was on your body? What was it like?
It was frightening.
Cold?
As cold as if you were making love to a dead body, sir. But I noticed one thing, Doctor. She had no bones. And then, the next moment, I was in the bush. You know, sir, I have had quite hairy experiences in my life. I have faced leopards and lions and buffaloes. It happens to anybody in Africa. But the experience with the Madinda was 20 times worse than that.
The case of that African is being investigated by John E. Mack, a professor of psychiatry at the Harvard Medical School and a Pulitzer Prize winner. Professor Mack has recently written a best-selling book called Abduction: Human Encounters with Aliens, based on his study of more than 70 cases. Struggling to gain some rational perspective on all this, I asked him if, as a psychiatrist, he felt reported abduction experiences could somehow be happening just in the mind.
No, it's not like that. It doesn't just occur in the mind. And unless we're going to extend the notion of mind to the entire cosmos being nothing but mind. Because there are physical dimensions to this. So it almost defies us to break down the literal category between the outside world and the inside world, the physical and the psychological. It's as if that construction of reality, that duality of the physical and the spiritual and the physical and the psychological doesn't hold up in the face of this experience.
Do you think perhaps there's some way in which physically something is happening, but that something else happens in a realm which is both physical and psychic?
Yeah, I think that if I understand you, that it is both physical and psychological. And it's a very powerful psychological experience that these people have, which is deeply meaningful, very difficult sometimes for them to recall in full detail. Obviously, it's traumatic to be taken against your will and subjected to these intrusive procedures, to have to keep it, at least until recently, quiet because people will be ridiculed. The official reality of the culture says this cannot be. And then finally, they can't predict when it's going to happen again. It doesn't make sense to say this is entirely self-generated. There are too many dimensions to the experience which are not consistent with that. For example, it occurs in children as young as 2, 2.5. I have 2 cases under 3 in my caseload, and those children described an intense feeling that little man comes from the sky and takes them up, and these are healthy, normal children, but they've had these experiences.
Did they finish up being harmed or helped by this?
Well, that's an extraordinarily important question. It is traumatic, it is upsetting, it is disturbing. On the other hand, when they face the experience directly, when they're open to it, when they recognize that we are participating in something powerful, I think it's probably healthy for the human species to be confronted with the fact that we are not the top of the cosmic hierarchy. I think that can only be healthy and good for us, but whether it's good for every person, I don't know.
Professor John Mack managing to find room for optimism among all these baffling reports. But David Jacobs, taking a trained historian's view, was not so optimistic when I asked him to sum up where he thought all this was leading.
We don't really know exactly what's going to happen, but I think you have to bear in mind that this is a phenomenon that exists for these beings' particular plans, goals, and objectives, not for ours. We have no say in this. We have no power over it, no control over it. And when they talk about the Earth, sometimes they will talk in terms of pollution is bad, environmental control has been bad, and so forth. They don't talk in terms of humans are suffering because of it. They talk in terms of the Earth having problems with that. But they leave us out of the equation.
Is it your impression that if it does end, that humanity will be able to breathe a sigh of relief and think that's over?
No, I don't think so. I think that it is not going to end by them leaving. I think it's going to end by them coming.
Ominous speculation from Professor David Jacobs. Whatever is to be made of these reported abductions, the fact that an increasing number of people in different countries are coming forward to report them and seek assistance is an undeniable fact. So I asked Bud Hopkins if he had come to any conclusion about what should be done to help them.
The first thing is, absolutely, the government has got to announce that it's taking the subject seriously. If their official government policy is, I don't care what you're saying, this could not have happened to you. You are either somehow mentally deranged to think this, or you're lying, because officially we know this can't happen. Now that's, of course, doing horrendous damage psychologically to the citizenry. So the government has got to backtrack from that policy and announce that we're now henceforward taking this seriously. We're looking into it. We want to gather reports and investigate these cases.
Research into the abduction phenomenon is clearly more advanced in the United States than in most countries. A recent major opinion poll on the subject there controversially concluded that 2% of the population, millions of people, could have had what is called some kind of anomalous experience. So I asked the Department of Health and Human Services in Washington if there were any plans to offer help with the problem. I was told in reply, we have no information on that subject. And I was promptly referred to the National Institute for Mental Health, who didn't call me back. So lack of understanding and open-mindedness about this whole subject is obviously widespread. And this is hard to live with for someone like Linda Cortile with her Brooklyn Bridge experience.
This isn't something that one would want to believe. It's frightening. But the way I look at it is, you see, if a person doesn't have an open mind, well, they can never learn anything. We had 22 people saw my hallucinations. Because when someone says that people like me are hallucinating or have sleep disorders, well, what it means is that others have seen my hallucinations. And if they can prove that one can see another's hallucinations, well, then they have the alien abduction phenomena beat.
The Abduction Phenomenon, Part 2 of the series UFOs, Fact, Fiction or Fantasy, was written and presented by Anthony Gray and produced by Angela Hind. The series is a La Fun Limited production.
BBC World Service on 648 kHz medium wave and on 90.2 MHz FM in Berlin. On the air 24 hours.